Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist, is credited by scholars with writing a series of reports and reviews and essays in the New York Tribune from December of 1844 until August of 1846. They're mistaken. Those were written by Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was myself in the 19th century. Not too long ago, I found a whole series of pieces that are practically identical in style and scope to those in the Tribune. Now, all of this material was signed with a star or single asterisk. That was Mathew Franklin Whittier's secret signature, or one of them, from 1829, from August of 1829. So in 1830, he started using that signature in the New York American. I found just shy of 400 articles that he wrote with that signature. And this is a period, we're talking 1830 until 1833, and then one more shows up in 1834. This is a period when Margaret Fuller had not published anything yet, and when she was not living in New York City, whereas Mathew Franklin Whittier was living in New York City. He was writing for the American. He was also writing for the New York Constellation. He also wrote for the Philadelphia Album and the Essayist in Boston. And for three of those publications, the American, the Essayist, and the Philadelphia Album, he signed with this same signature, a star, and he sounds exactly the same in all of these. He was reviewing books in the Essayist, he was writing editorials for the Philadelphia Album, and he was writing all of the above for the American, all with the star. And then when we come to 1844 and we see the star showing up there, it's the same author and the same material with the same philosophy, the same writing style, everything's the same. So what we're going to do is compare on one topic, and the topic we're going to choose is women's education. We're going to see what the star had to say about women's education in 1831, 32, and 33 in these three different publications that Mathew was publishing in, the American and the Philadelphia Album and the Essayist in Boston, which was a monthly. And then we're going to compare on the same topic with what we see in the New York Tribune. I'm just going to read these things straight through. I'll put them up on the screen. Some of them I have physical copies of, some I don't. And I'll just briefly mention that Mathew, as a man, was a liberal man, and but he still had his culture's view about women, I mean, to some extent. And basically, he was a compassionate young man and a liberal young man, and he wanted to see young women get an education. But he didn't necessarily want to see them supplant men. See, that was going too far for him. He wanted them to get an education, so then they'd be able to teach their sons, and they'd have something, if they'd never married, to fall back on and make their parents happy and so on. But he didn't see them supplanting men in the workplace or anything like that, not in the 1830s and really not in the mid-1840s either. This is something that has confused scholars, because when they look at Margaret Fuller's different expressed views, they think it's all her about women, about what we would now call feminism. It's not consistent. Some of it sounds more like a liberal man. That's because it was a liberal man. The part signed under a star was not Margaret Fuller. Therefore, it doesn't sound like a woman. It sounds like a liberal man, see? So that's the answer to that quandary. So now I'm going to go ahead and read these straight through with maybe a little tiny bit of commentary. And we are going to start with the New York American. This is the February 11, 1832 edition of the New York American. He's reviewing The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes would become his personal friend. They may have been friends now, but Mathew took objection to one of the points that Oliver Wendell Holmes said about women and education, and this is what he had to say. With much extravagance, there is some point and some show of reason in these remarks. It is but a show, however, for women cannot be overeducated. That's what Oliver Wendell Holmes had said, if they are well educated. Nor does it by any means follow that their ambition will increase in an equal ratio with their mental improvement. If it did, though it must be admitted that a blue is a bore, that means a blue stocking or an intellectual woman. Yet the calm pride springing from intellectual cultivation is preferable to the restless vanity which in weak minds is the offspring of personal charms, the one driving its origin from the assiduity of its possessor, and the other owing its birth to the caprice of nature. But we again deny that women can be over-educated. The expense in the care that is lavished upon their minds is much more rarely thrown away than it is upon men, and their bestowal upon females far more often, like that of charity, recompenses with blessings him who gives and her who receives, the one in the accomplishments of the daughter, exercised to cheer in after years the gloomy hours of the parent, and the other having always, if single, a refuge from the rude world in their mental resources, and if married, a heritage for their offspring, of which that world cannot deprive them. To the position which women hold at present in society is owing all the superiority of civilization which modern times may claim over the most refined periods of Greece and Rome. You may speculate forever upon the causes of the gradual improvement of society, but no ingenuity will avail to disprove the effect of female influence. To women, educated and accomplished woman, even more than to religion, we speak it with reverence and point to countries where Christianity is more active than a respect for the sex. To women do we owe all of civilization or refinement that if society were completely disorganized would be worth snatching from the wreck. I want to make a quick caveat here that I'm reading from my typed copy now instead of from the original, and that has its own hazards because sometimes there might be a typo and I'll just read straight through it. But when you're looking at the original on the screen, you won't see that typo and it's jarring. So I apologize. Sometimes I try to go in and dub it over with audio, but that usually sounds artificial, so I may just leave them. Just know that I'm reading from my typed copy and there may be some typos in here. Now, we're going to turn to the Philadelphia Album and Ladies Portfolio. This is the September 10, 1831 edition. This is also signed with a star, same writer, different publication. Matthew was working probably for a trader in New York City, and his work would take him probably to Philadelphia and Boston, so he had relationships with the newspapers and the editors in those cities also. Female education. Could we grave it with a point of steel, in deep wounds upon every neglecting parent's heart? Could we write it upon the walls of every parlor, in letters of living fire? Could we teach the playful lightning to chase in form of letters across the black thundercloud? We would have it written in terms so palpable that none could shut it from their view. Educate your daughters. At the present period of advancement in refinement, there is no subject calculated more strongly to elicit the regret of the philanthropist than the neglect which is displayed in the tuition of the female sex. And when we consider the important station which woman occupies in her career of life, how shall we account for this wanton carelessness? When we consider the influence of the mother in training the susceptibilities and directing the inclinations of the infant mind, how shall we account for the negligence which impairs the ability and tends to the total disqualification of the parent for the important and binding duties which devolves upon her? Yet, unaccountable as it may appear, such is the lamentable fact that scarcely one female out of 100 is to be found possessed of that mental cultivation and those habits of literary application which will enable her to direct the infant mind in a proper channel and to instill into it an early ambition in the pursuits of science. Now again, note that he is advocating women's education so that mothers can educate their sons. See, that's not a female radical feminist perspective, but it is a liberal male perspective for 1831. Now, this is in the Essayist. This was a monthly young man's magazine in Boston that Mathew also wrote for. He wrote reviews, signing as a star for this publication. He also wrote other things, signing Franklin Jr., so poems and essays and other things, but he used a different signature for those. So all the star in the essayist is Mathew writing book reviews. In this case, it's a college he's reviewing. New college. The ladies succeed with their influence everywhere and in almost everything. It is to this that we attribute the fact that a new college has recently been chartered in Indiana with power to confer degrees on females. These degrees are to be doctors of natural science, of English literature, of belles letters, of the fine arts, and of arts and sciences. Now keep in mind, Mathew has his tongue in his cheek because this is going a little too far for him, see? He's on the fence about it. Thus it seems that the ladies have pressed forward into the front ranks with wreaths and garlands. Heaven forfend the consequences now, should they be fatal. We knew the chase was laggard and dull, that many an intellect reposed in inglorious ease on beds of roses, that there was wanted some eagle spirit to lead the van. But little did we dream that a palsy so deathlike benumbed the strong-hearted aspirants to fame as to give the precedence and lead to the weak-natured and the weak-hearted by heaven's decree. Look on this, ye lazy bachelors of art. Will nothing rouse you from your inglorious repose? Will you look listlessly on and see your once bright honors torn from your heads? You heard the notes of preparation as they sounded far and wide. You saw the maidens on their winding way. You permitted them to take from your hand the trumpet of fame, nor were you aroused when they wound the first loud blast of triumph. If you do not soon wake up, your eyes may behold this terrific vision. And then we have a publication here, The Mathematics Illustrated, with a treatise on hydrostatics, hydraulics, and pneumatics by Lydia Bluestocking, Doctress of Science, etc., Boston, and there is the star, his signature. Now let's move to the New York Tribune now that we get a sense of what Mathew is for and what he's a little bit uncertain about and so on as a liberal man. Here we have the September 30, 1845 edition. And the star, who I'm telling you is Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was myself in that era. Much has been written about woman's keeping within her sphere, which is defined as the domestic sphere. As a little girl, she is to learn the lighter family duties, while she acquires that limited acquaintance with the realm of literature and science that will enable her to superintend the instruction of children in their earliest years. It is not generally proposed that she should be sufficiently instructed and developed to understand the pursuits or aims of her future husband. She is not to be a helpmeet to him in the way of companionship or counsel, except in the care of his house and children. Her youth is to be passed partly in learning to keep house and the use of the needle, partly in the social circle, where her manners may be formed, ornamental accomplishments perfected and displayed, and the husband found who shall give her the domestic sphere for which exclusively she is to be prepared. Were the destiny of woman thus exactly marked out, did she invariably retain the shelter of a parent's or a guardian's roof till she married? Did marriage give her a sure home and protector? Were she never liable to be made a widow, or if so, sure of finding immediate protection from a brother or new husband, so that she might never be forced to stand alone one moment? And were her mind given for this world only, with no faculties capable of eternal growth and infinite improvement, we would still demand for her a far wider and more generous culture than is proposed by those who so anxiously define her sphere. We would demand it that she might not ignorantly or frivolously thwart the designs of her husband, that she might be the respected friend of her sons no less than her daughters, that she might give more refinement, elevation, and attraction to the society which is needed to give the character of men polish and plasticity, no less so than to save them from vicious and sensual habits. But the most fastidious critic on the departure of woman from her sphere, can scarcely fail to see at present that a vast proportion of the sex, if not the better half, cannot have this domestic sphere. Thousands and scores of thousands in this country, no less than in Europe, are obliged to maintain themselves alone. Far greater numbers divide with their husbands the care of earning a support for the family. In England now, the progress of society has reached so admirable a pitch that the position of the sexes is frequently reversed, and the husband is obliged to stay at home and mind the house and bairns while the wife goes forth to the employment she alone can secure. So you see that the star writer he would be okay if it was necessary for women to, only get the bare education necessary if they were assured of a place, if their husband died or if they couldn't get a husband. He wouldn't like it, but, okay, if we have to go there, And then he says, but that's not often the case. That's not a woman's perspective. That's not a feminist perspective, So I'm sure people will say, yes, but this was the mid-1800s and that was as radical as a woman could get. No, it wasn't. There were some very radical women, and Margaret Fuller was supposedly one of them, see? So this is a man writing here. So you would need a lot more examples. In my paper, which I'll link below, in one of those papers, I have several examples on different topics, not just on women's education. And if you get to the end of that paper, if you read through and take the time to read the entire paper, you will see that there's 5 or 6 different topics on which I've made comparisons between the New York American and the star in that paper and the star in the New York Tribune. So it's just a little piece of evidence. It's just to give you an idea. Don't say, oh, you haven't proved the case. I didn't try to prove the case. I just gave you some examples.